Red's the most important. Okay. So I think we're gonna get started. So first off, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming out tonight. For those who don't know, my name is Caroline Deemer and I'm the programming coordinator here at the Wisconsin Maritime Museum. And I am so excited to welcome you guys to this month's Think and Drink. So Think and Drinks, for those who don't know, are a free monthly speaker series that happens on the first Thursday evening of every month. This year we're holding a year of free talks focused on stories of both historical and modern great women of the Great Lakes and beyond. So this month I am super excited to have living historian Katie Barron come and talk to us about waves and SPARS. Before I let Katie start, I would like to thank our sponsor, the Wisconsin Humanities Council. Wisconsin Humanities Council is the reason that we can bring these talks to you and have them be free. The Wisconsin Humanities Council strengthens our democracy through cultural programs that build connections and understanding between people of all backgrounds and beliefs throughout the state. I would also like to thank both Katie for bringing her lovely collection here, as well as the Two Rivers Historical Society for bringing an original painting by Lester Bentley, yes, of the SPARS advertisement. So that's a real treat for us who are here today. So I will let Katie get started.
All right, hopefully everyone can see me, and welcome everyone. Welcome everyone online as well. So my name is Katie Barron. I am a living historian of 10 years. I've been specializing in the waves and SPARS for about that long. It was my first impression, and it's something that I've been really passionate about since I have a family history with the Navy. But also, too, I've gotten recently into the Coast Guard, so that's been a nice sort of deviation from the Navy for a change at that point. But I'm also, in my daytime job, an attorney for the codes and regulations for the state of Massachusetts, and also in my spare time, ample spare time, I suppose, I am an operator over at the Minnesota Streetcar Museum, and I operate a 116-year-old trolley, one of our original trolleys from the Twin Cities lines. So I've been a bit busy over the years. So today I'm really happy to be bringing us the waves and SPARS. So this would be, of course, the women in the Coast Guard and the Navy during World War II. And who were the waves and SPARS? So first off, let's just talk about what brought this up. For most folks, I think we have a good understanding that women were integral to the World War II effort on the home front and also abroad. But for the waves and SPARS in the Navy in particular, the waves were sort of that step into having the clerical positions being taken over by women who would have been the non-combatants and other roles going forward as well. And that sort of went into the SPARS from there. The acronyms are WAVES, W-A-V-E-S, and SPARS to represent the women accepted for voluntary emergency service or volunteer emergency service, and the SPARS, Semper Paratus, always ready. Now, that was interesting because with the acronyms, every branch, except for the Marines, developed an acronym for their women, just because it was kind of a cutesy thing, I suppose, at the time. But also, too, it's really interesting because the SPARS, as we'll later on learn, were named by Dorothy Stratton, who was the then captain at the time. But it's also for the spar deck of a boat, or it would be the spar for the masts and such. Basically, it was the supporting beam of a boat. And so because of that, she thought that that was appropriate to bring into the SPARS, or the women. So we can't really talk about women in World War II without mentioning women in World War I. And it's actually interesting because, as a lawyer, I really like how this came about. So the Naval Act of 1916 didn't mention specifics. It just mentioned that all persons who may be capable of performing special useful service for coastal defense were able to apply for the Navy. Well, at that time, folks sat down and said, so that means women, right? And since there was nothing that was specifically prohibiting women at that time, that is how the ladies joined the Navy. And so for that reason, we have the ladies joining right around 1917. So this is a bit later on in the war, of course, because of course, America is getting into World War I a bit late in the game, so to speak. And so they're utilized as the radio operators, the stenographers, nurses, messengers, chauffeurs, etc. And realistically, we have what we would call the yeoman, which would be yeoman F, to signify, of course, women. But they would also be the Ets as well. And they end up being discharged by about 1920. It wasn't, again, something that was supposed to be permanent per se, but they really did prove their usefulness at that time. So because of that, that sort of set the stage for what ends up happening later on when we talk about the waves. But we can't talk about the waves until we talk about the WWII and the creation of the WWII. And my grandma was a WWII, so the WWII also have a very special place in my heart. So the creation of the WWII comes from Edith Norris Rogers, really, as the first sort of initial push. She's a representative from Massachusetts, and she was overseas during World War I and saw the benefit of women in the service being able to actually go through and really participate. And so when World War II came around, she said, why aren't our women just as capable as those ladies overseas? And in fact, of course, we were. So that's when she came about and said around 1942, this is something that we should bring to the Army and that we should go through and sort of, push this to Congress to say, hey, these are ladies that can actually help if we create this organization. And of course, it does go through, but importantly enough, in an auxiliary status. And that's why I have the WAAC up here, because the auxiliary status signified that they weren't necessarily part of the Army. That being important because that means that the benefits and the honors, so to speak, according to them, were not accorded to them. And that's even more important realistically when we talk about discharge and getting out, because there were ladies who were discharged under the WWII, but that meant that they didn't have the veterans resources that were available to them and the various different things that may have been accorded to the men who had been part of the same thing during that time, of course, in the regular Army service. Well, the Navy saw that. And the Navy said, okay, well, we need people too. So what did they do? They said, when we create the waves, and this was pushed through with Roosevelt with the public law, and that was Public Law 689. That means that when we create the waves, they're going to be fully integrated into the Navy. And that was a big thing. Another big thing was recruiting Captain Mildred McAfee to be the first director. McAfee was a phenomenal woman. And I mean, most of these women were phenomenal, but she was phenomenal in that she was highly educated. She comes from Wellesley College as the dean. She was about 36 at the time. So, I mean, she's right around my age. And I mean, that's just incredible to think. So she was a very intelligent woman. And she looked at this from a great business perspective. She said, I want our women to be educated and to represent the best that we have to offer here. And so because of that, she went through and she recruited very heavily from teachers. And you will see that with the folks that she pulled in, that they were oftentimes from universities, other colleges, so to speak. And then also too from, just teachers out from middle of nowhere, Wisconsin. But they were all highly educated women. They were all supposed to be, very much that well brought up woman that would be represented well. And Dorothy Stratton was part of those. So Captain Dorothy Stratton initially was part of the Waves. Again, another incredible lady. So when the SPARS were created, because of course the Coast Guard also was going to need the help, When they were created around the 23rd, Stratton was picked from the Waves, where she was initially in as an officer as well, and she became that first female commissioned officer in the U.S. Coast Guard. So also too of interest and of local interest to us, she was serving at one point as the assistant to the commanding officer at the radio school for Waves in Madison, Wisconsin. So, so she was in Wisconsin for a time. And like I mentioned earlier, Stratton did choose that SPARS acronym. I actually had a copy, and of course, I didn't pack it amid everything else that I brought tonight. But she had a nice short letter that basically talked about the creation of the acronym, because the other ones were just sort of a jumble of letters. And at that point in time, she was like, this is just too much. Let's go with SPARS. It's cut to the chase, and basically it represents who we are. So eligibility requirements. I apologize for the list. This is my most intense slide, I promise. But this is the enlistment requirements for enlisted women. So basically women who wouldn't have been part of the officer corps. So it would have been for the duration of the war plus 6 months. So of course, we hoped the war wasn't going to go very long, but we didn't know. So duration of the war, 6 months later, although most gals were discharged pretty summarily after the war ended. Must be an American citizen, at least 20 with parental consent, and then up to 36. So it was one of those things where by 36, we're kind of looking at getting into more of the officer corps at that point. So, but later on, women could join up later, but married women may enlist. That was a big sticking point, because a lot of times people were at that point of saying, you know, should we let married women come in? There was a big emphasis, like with the WWII beforehand, that when women would get pregnant or when women would get married in general, that their biggest duty was to their home and to their family. And so because of that, that became a huge sticking point for the service branches. But eventually they sort of settled on the fact that if your husband isn't in the respective service branch that you join, you're okay. Also, too, officer and enlisted in marriage was a little bit taboo as well, although it did happen, but that's another sort of side note. It happens. No dependents under 18. Again, that whole thing about having, you know, being able to be free and not necessarily tied to the home. Good character with 3 references. So again, this kind of ties back to what we were talking about with being having a good standing and, you know, being a good representative of your community. The 2 years of high school or business school. So that would have been, it will come back. There we go. I know y'all are not done with it too. The 2 years of high school or business school, of course, passing the Navy physical, which interestingly enough is fairly basic. You know, we think about it kind of in bigger terms nowadays, but it was pretty basic back in that point. I love this. Natural teeth or satisfactory replacement. And the best part is, in one of my books, it's actually underlined satisfactory replacements. So I'm wondering if the lady had satisfactory replacements or if that was required. Able to hear that whispered word at 15 feet. The eyes can be corrected with glasses back to 2020. So you do see waves with glasses. That's kind of a normal thing. At least 5 feet tall and at least 95 pounds. So that is a tiny woman. And believe it or not, when we have looked back at the records, there are a lot of women that did not meet that requirement. Of course, we're coming off of the Depression era. A lot of ladies who are coming in are very thin just because of their circumstances from finances and such like that. And so because of that, the recruiters would tell them, go and eat a banana and a sundae and come back right afterwards. So you can kind of edge it up. So a lot of ladies did that, and that's how they were able to make the weight. And I see it a lot in the books, and it's funny because it's like, man, that would be great. Go run down to the Sunday shop and be like, yeah, this is what I got to do for my homework. Why not? So, yeah. So, and then the officers were pretty much the same there. But we're looking at 20 to 49 for officer corps. The education is going to be, of course, like officers today with that college degree or professional experience that's kind of commiserate to what you would have been doing. So, of course, clerical or secretary, things like that. The physical is going to be the same with just the differences with the vision. And then the teeth. So you can have now 18 sound teeth. And you have to kind of have them like parallel in your mouth. And I think about it in terms of like the Civil War, where it was like you had to have the two teeth on the top, teeth on the bottom to tear off your cartridge so you could, load your musket. So that's kind of what was running through my mind when that requirement came out. And enlisted women can become officers after 6 months of service. So that is important because, of course, that does show that opportunity to sort of rise through the ranks. We have that sort of thing today as well in the Marine Corps. I know it's called being a Mustang. And so you would go through, you would be able to do your due diligence and perhaps earn a commission. And I really like this picture. It's just a really cute picture of a couple SPARS officers, but it plays a little bit into what I talk about next with the uniforms. But what could they do? So there's various different schools around the country. So one of them, again, is in Wisconsin. We do have that University of Wisconsin, the radio school here. We have a couple schools around, like you would go through basic at like Palm Beach, or you would be going through in Connecticut at the Coast Guard Academy for the officers. You have a couple different areas like with the Great Lakes training would be a big one, at least for gals around here. And you would learn basic traits, basic talents, and then you would go into your specialist schools. Sometimes you didn't. Sometimes you will see a couple uniforms with just hash marks on them. And those are sort of the Johnny on the spots, I like to call them, because they would be folks that could do a whole range of jobs. They weren't really tasked with anything specialized. Yeah. Yep. But if you were going into other things, you would have various different specialties. So a lot of these are different special schools for various things like technical, radio, photographers, things like that. You would get your radio men. That was a very important job. You would get your aviation mechanist mate, and you would get your metalsmith and your areographer's mate. And parachute riggers, of course, were important as well. So it's not just the owlmen, it's going to be your storekeepers, a lot of those different roles. But realistically, this did represent a lot of ground force when it comes down to it, when you talk about everybody that this covered at the time. So I kind of wanted to do a collage slide, a couple collage slides, because it just really gives us a really cool demonstration of what these jobs would have looked like, sort of, okay, glamorized a bit. But we have a couple examples of just what you would have been doing, of course, with
those striped socks.
So I saw that as well. That when I was doing my research, so usually you're wearing white socks with the uniform. So usually with the pants, it would have been the white sock and the Oxford. And so when I saw that, I was like, I don't know yet if that's a colorization or if that's something to do with that, or if that is her just throwing on whatever socks she has and doing her job. And that's really interesting that they would get a picture of that like this too.
Right.
So yeah, I saw that, and that's also why I put it in the slide. But the other cool parts about this too, again, it shows the various different uniform combinations. And I have a couple of the different uniform combinations up here as well on the table. But you can kind of see, that the ladies weren't necessarily always in the uniform that I'm in right now. This would be a work uniform. This is appropriate to be going to work, going to your job, of course, doing radio and work and such. But I might take this jacket off and just wear the blouse with the tie there, or I might be doing other duties that require, wait for it, that require maybe a seersucker dress here. or various other things. I find it really interesting how versatile the uniforms were and just various different combinations and how strong they were. Realistically, the fabric was very strong. I had to include this one. This is a picture of the ladies marching at Camp Randall. So in Madison, of course. And that is particularly of importance to me, or just significance to me, because of course Camp Randall being where the Wisconsin regiments were being mustered in during the Civil War, thus the name Camp Randall. So this was a great intersection of my two interests. And let's talk about the uniforms. Because honestly, it was a great recruitment tool. And it's something that we can lean into because when I was talking about the WWII, one of the things about the WWII uniform, the WAAC uniform, was that it was actually created on a man's dress form initially. So you're talking about a very boxy cut, and then they slapped a belt on it because they're like, you just cinch it, right? And I mean, that doesn't, no. So it didn't fit right. The ladies complained about it all the time. And so, you know, of course, the fact that appearances are really playing into how you are going to comport yourself and how you represent your branch, the Navy picked up on this and ended up bringing in the fashion designer manbochet, or you would hear manbocker sometimes. And they actually had in Chicago, they had the exhibit in Chicago a little while ago, which they had his other clothes. But the beautiful thing about these uniforms was it was designed to be super versatile. And so the design of the uniform itself, I mean, as you can see, it really is a timeless design. It's that A-line skirt. It's that nicely tailored jacket. If I took off the insignia today, you probably wouldn't think anything of this being an 80-year-old suit. Again, important, because once the Navy came out with this and said, we give you designer clothes when you join the Navy, suddenly the women were really interested. And so that was a great PR move by the Navy. And so that ends up being a big reason why a lot of ladies join, because they start to see it and they start basically boiling it down to which uniform do I think I'm going to look the best in. And I have polled my friends. They say that I look the best in the Navy uniform. I have all the other service branches uniforms. So there we go. That still wins out today. And of course, with the SPARS following suit, the SPARS just went through, copied basically what the WWIIs were wearing. And the difference is going to be that insignia on my collar, of course. So with the Navy, you'll see that that's the fouled anchor on the collar. Here with me with the Coast Guard, I'm going to have those shields of the Coast Guard. That's also going to be accordingly on my cover. And also too, with the covers for the officers, you're going to see that bucket cover, but you'll see the Navy officer insignia for the Navy. And then the SPARS with the more winged eagle would be that officer insignia for the SPARS too. Just some more. I had to throw in some more. So this is different variations of the uniforms as well, which was important to sort of throw in here because you had things like the hospital corps dress here, which would have been a plain blue smock, basically. Cornflower blue is how it's described, and they've got a couple examples of some cornflower blue stuff here. But that would have been for the ladies in the hospital, accordingly. You see here on the bottom with a couple of the SPARS here, you'll see again, you've got a bunch of different rates here. But again, a dark blue shirt. So that is significant because I'm wearing my white blouse right now. This is more of that dress uniform since I'm here to give a presentation. Of course, I'm going to be more dressed up. If I'm doing work or if this would have been more of my day job, I probably would have been wearing my blue shirt because that's going to be a bit more undressed. And that blue shirt here, as you can see, they're probably doing some work and they're going to have that color coordinated tie with the cornflower blue tie. Another thing too, over in the corner there, you'll see the aviation mechanic overall, and that was very lightly used. The thing with that is that when you look at that coverall, it's going to be a different coverall than the men's coverall. It's going to be cut different. It's going to have different amenities. And the ladies did like it. They thought it was very comfortable. But again, it does serve a purpose because, of course, you don't want to get your grease all over your uniform. But I was here for Subfest, which come see Subfest. Come back. We love Subfest. 4th of July. It's always fun. And I was wearing my dungarees. So these are reproductions from my friends. But they're pretty much faithful reproductions of the material and everything. And I tried to get them dirty. I went down to that sub and tried to get them dirty. And they didn't get too dirty. So I'm going to try to roll around in some oil over at our commemorative Air Force and see if plain oil will do anything to them. But they're way too crisp right now. I'm just a little upset. So, but they're great for the summertime. And then, of course, at the bottom here, we have our exercise suits. So again, another really cool thing about this, I have a friend who makes bows, and so he made me a bow that would be appropriate to have for exercise and recreation at this point in time. So do have that, but you would have had your little sort of jumpsuit, little shorts and such, and so you would have been able to do your exercises and not have to worry about getting your uniform dirty. Except I have seen where the ladies on the basketball team wear white shorts and then their white blouse. And I don't know how they pulled that off because my goodness, you get these things dirty and it's just like, I don't even want to touch that. So another important one to note is that the Navy did end up integrating the service to an extent, with ladies coming in, the Black women coming in a bit later on in 1944. Now, in the Navy, Mildred McAfee was very much on the ball with this and very much interested in recruiting these women. But it was Congress that ultimately was sort of giving that pushback. And so finally, in 1944, they get the permission, and the SPARS not until early 1945. And Harriet Pickens and Frances Wills become the first female commissioned officers for Black ladies in the Navy. And this is interesting because their story is, again, very highly educated women, but their story is really interesting because they would go to the mess hall and they said the only faces that looked like them would be those who were behind the lunch counter. And they said that the guys would come out and stare at them. And because not only were they women in service, but they're Black ladies in officer uniform. And that's something that even the men couldn't aspire to at that point. And so it was a very profound experience. And they talk about that at length when they go through their memoirs. And it's a very interesting and, poignant point in our history. And also too, Olivia Hooker was the first Black woman who enlisted in the SPARS. So there was 5 ladies who enlisted with her. And so that was right about how many were able to join by that point. But she is also another fabulous lady who I do encourage to go through and look at her story, because she survived the Tulsa massacres. And when she was a young girl, and she became a doctor later on in life, just a fabulous career woman, but I mean, very much a trailblazer. So I would definitely encourage looking her up. So demobilization and legacy. So as the war came to an end, of course, we're talking about, the duration plus 6 months. By that point in time, we're looking at about 100,000 women had joined the waves at point in time, and about 11,000 SPARS. And that is both the enlisted and the officers. So at this point, there's kind of a question mark and a question on the table, because now that the war is over, of course, the men are coming home. Of course, we don't have to field the men out there in the front lines, and suddenly they can get their jobs back. Well, the ladies back at home said, well, we kind of like it here. And there was a very interesting push and pull from a lot of the women who wanted to remain, because of course you did have the ladies that wanted to leave. You did have the ladies who were happy to go back once their job was done. But a lot of the women also said, this could be a nice career for us, and this could be a great career option for the future. And so because of that, once the WWII and the SPARS were demobilized right around 1946-ish, there was now a push on the back end to talk to President Truman into having them reactivated, basically, and reintegrated back into the service. Now, that's also important because, again, we're talking about reserves. So we aren't talking about that full integration into the military as we know it in terms of that active duty. We're talking about reservists. And so initially women had to go through and had to fight tooth and nail just to get to that reserve point. And that does come, as you can see here, and that's going to be on June 12th in 1948 with the Women's Armed Services Integration Act. And so that opens the door for the WWII again, that opens the door for the WWII. And it is important to note, too, that as we go through the 50s, 60s, and 70s even, those names still come into play on DD-214s. So there are ladies who served in the 60s who were still WWIIs, even though by this time we are looking at the integration, the full activation of these ladies. And my husband actually works for the state of Minnesota VA. And so, sometimes he will say, hey, I've got a WWII, and she's perhaps in her 70s or so. But it's interesting to see that and to note that, that history comes from the 40s and then carried through. And then obviously today we now just simply refer to them as soldiers, sailors, and Marines and everything accordingly. So yeah. So that is the end of my presentation, everyone. Thank you so much for listening. I love this photo of the ladies having Thanksgiving dinner, the SPARS having Thanksgiving dinner. It's just such a cute photo. So I wanted to close off our talk with that. All right, I think we're opening it up for questions. Yes.
I thought there were women that were spies and also that helped, carry men out of, that were hurt, in service. They flew a lot of ladies in the Air Force and stuff. So I wondered, that's all part of this, right?
Yeah, so the question is for folks online, were there the women that were on basically the front lines who were part of the nurse corps? And yes. So the WWII and the SPARS wouldn't have been particularly part of those two branches or the nurse corps itself. They did have pharmacist mates. They did have gals that would have been part of the medical corps generally. But we had the Army Nurse Corps and then we had the Navy Nurse Corps that were out there doing that. The Army nurse and the Navy nurse would have been a flight nurse. So actually my dad was a flight nurse, so he's part of that tradition. But yeah, that would have been those ladies. With the WWII and the SPARS, the only time they would have been overseas, and I say overseas in quotes because we don't really think about it as overseas right now, but that would be with Hawaii. So they would have been sent over.
And did they spy for?
To a certain extent, the spying really was part of just spying, I suppose, part of the other movements. I'm sure they would have at some point, but not necessarily to my knowledge, but there's also two, in that same vein, the code breakers. Yes. So ladies, yes. So the ladies in the Navy would have been pulled to do the code breaking. And that is due, as I said, to that high level of education. And so because of that, a lot of these ladies were tested and eventually brought into that code breaking organization. So, and a lot of those ladies would have been working in Washington, D.C., but there was also those on the Pacific coast as well.
Okay. Interesting.
There's actually a really good book about that. It's called Code Girls. Okay. And for folks that are interested, there's an adult version and there's actually a young adult version as well. So I highly suggest that book. Yep, Code Girls. Yes.
What got you personally interested in this topic? I know you said you've been doing like living history for like a decade or so, but what inspired you to pursue this topic?
So the question is, what got me personally interested into doing this as a hobby? So it's actually kind of an interesting story. I just have always been very interested in history, just really loved history. And the way that I really understood that I really wanted to delve further into the Navy was because I was at Pearl Harbor with my mom and my stepdad, and we toured the Missouri. And I instantly fell in love, just instantly. And my grandpa, like I alluded to beforehand with our Navy tradition, my grandpa was actually stationed on the Iowa for a time, so her sister ship. And so from there, it kind of grew. I didn't know about living history until I visited historic Fort Snelling over in St. Paul, and kind of went from there into, I can actually do this in terms of an educational opportunity. And initially, I didn't even want to do World War II per se. Initially, I was interested in doing a female soldiering impression for the Civil War. So that was my sort of initial push. And because of that, I ended up going further into it and realizing that, you know, the women of World War II could also be represented. And so because I initially had wanted to join the Navy, and Dad told me to join the Air Force, like him. But I really did have that love of the sea and everything. So I, at that point, knew that that was going to be sort of where I went into in terms of really focusing. And so my collection grew. Yes.
Do you know what the specific like naval requirements for the physical was?
So there's just kind of a list of things, just basic, push-up, pull-ups sort of things. Of course, it's a little bit different just for the ladies, just to accommodate, but it really wasn't anything very strenuous. I mean, it would have been basically half an hour in the morning, so to speak, of PT, just kind of like for the guys. But yeah, I don't think it was very strenuous, just kind of run-of-the-mill tests and such.
In the beginning it wasn't, but it got that way.
It did get that way. Yeah. Yes, it did.
But did you learn guns and all that kind of stuff?
The ladies, yes. The question being, did the women handle the weapons and such? And yes, the women in the Navy and the SPARS would have learned basic sort of handgun, so basically pistols, not necessarily rifles, but if you were doing shore patrol, for example, you probably would have had a firearm at some point. The ladies in the Marine Corps got to learn how to use the M1 carbine. And there's a picture of me doing that. So I love that. I love our carbine. It's a nice little thing. But yeah, so historically you would have been comfortable with that personally, but then also too, you could have been a gunner's mate. So like with our guns out on the cobia here, the ladies would have been familiarized enough to know how to use those in order to train the men on them. And again, another reason why with women in the Navy and the SPARS, why they wanted teachers, because an aptitude for teaching, obviously, for that purpose was important.
Okay.
All right.
Any last questions?
Switch.
Yep. Well, can you join me once again in thanking Katie? It was an excellent presentation. I really learned a lot. It's a lot of fun. If you guys enjoyed this program and want to see more like it, as I said, we have a whole year of these talks going on. Next month is a super cool one. We are going to have Gio Rutherford, who is a famous TikToker. She does a series called Spooky Lakes, where she talks about the weird and wonderful worlds of all of the odd lakes of the world. But she's also a very talented artist. So she's going to be coming and talking about how she does environmental education through art. So really, really cool lady. So that is going to be, oh my God, it's going to be April 4th at 6:30. But also we do have a couple of exciting events in between then. The one that's the most exciting is we are going to be having a birthday party for USS Cobia. She's going to be turning 81. So there's going to be reduced admission that day. It's going to be $8. We're going to have carnival games. We're going to have cake. We're going to have some of our lovely reenactors out on the boat as well. So it's going to just be a fun day altogether, and that's going to be on March 23rd. So if you guys want to come and hang out with us, I would be really happy to see you. I'll probably be running around in a birthday hat because I think it's fun. So yeah, thank you so much for coming out. If you guys enjoy these programs and want to see more like it, please consider supporting the museum. Supporting the museum and these programs can look a couple different ways. You can donate, you can become a member, or you can just tell your friends and family about our programs and bring them along as well. We really appreciate all of you guys who come out. So yeah, thank you so much.
So